So Zoe got in touch with me about 6 weeks ago, and she asked me if I wanted to present, and she mentioned the topic of automating the architecture, and it got me thinking, how can I apply that? What can I talk about? And one journey kind of came to mind, and it's something that we're going to talk about as part of this presentation, really. But the key theme that I find important is that to start with the end in mind. We'll talk a little bit more about it throughout the talk, but it's more about understanding where you want to get to, and then you can kind of figure out how you want to get there. So, it's going to work? No. Hang on a sec. Let's try again. So, a little bit about myself. I've been in software testing for about 11 years. I started work at a consultancy for the first 3 years, ended up moving from company to company, worked with places like EasyJet, Aviva, some hedge funds. I didn't really like the fact that I couldn't really see projects all the way through to the end. Couldn't see the bigger picture. So I joined ASOS 8 years ago. I hadn't even heard of ASOS when I joined. Now most people have heard of ASOS. So I've been there 8 years, kind of seeing the company grow. When I joined, we had 2 development teams. We now have probably around 80 development teams, 200 QAs. So it's been a mammoth growth. I am a husband and father to 2 lovely kids. I am a Sunderland fan. The less said about that, the better. And that's my Twitter and blog. I don't blog too much, but when I do, I try and make it interesting and good. About my role as a lead QA, so as I mentioned, we have like 80 development teams. I work across probably around 10 development teams. Should know that, but it's around that number. I don't just work with the teams, I work with the QAs, I work with mentoring and coaching them, understanding kind of what good testing is. And to kind of help us do that, myself and the other lead QAs come up with some quality engineering values that we try and adhere to, but I also jump in and help however and whenever, really. That's kind of how this kind of story came about. So a little bit about the team that I ended up helping. It's built on Cycle. Hands up, who's heard of Cycle? Hey, some people, cool. So it's kind of like off-the-shelf CMS platform. We do a lot of additional functionalities on top, and there's 4 teams that kind of develop on top of this platform, and they deploy and release as one team. They were confident that their individual packages work in isolation. In that, I mean, they deployed to their test environment, they tested their stuff, they didn't care about the other 3 teams. Integrating them with each other is kind of where the fun begins. So 4 days before release, teams would deploy to an integration environment. This was the first real time that their code was tested with other teams' code. There were problems. It would go in, pre-prod, then production. Often it would take more than 4 days. But what could possibly go wrong? Well, we had some problems. One of them was we had a whole host of automated tests, but they were failing a lot. And not only were they failing, they were very UI heavy. We had about 300 UI tests, I think. And that's not including our API tests and so forth. There was a lack of understanding around the automation, what it did, how it worked. No one really understood what it was doing, what it was testing. And that meant that we couldn't really target our exploratory testing because we didn't understand what the automation was telling us. We had no version control of the browsers that it was running on, and that meant it was running on the build agents. Could be Chrome version 61.3, no one really knew. But hey, it was failing, it was ignored, and not really many people cared. And it took about 45 minutes to run. So we weren't getting that quick feedback that we wanted. Deployments also took a long time, similar to the failing tests. So I mean, we took 4 days to release anything to production, and that is not acceptable. There's a lack of understanding about how the deployments work, and there was a lot of manual interventions. So what it's meant, we had no confidence. We had no confidence in the automated tests. There was tons of muted, ignore tests. And if you mute and ignore tests, just delete them because you're not giving you any value. Deployments, we had no confidence in the deployments. Again, they'd fail randomly at certain points. No one really knew why they were failing. Just retry. Blind luck, just retry. Hope that it worked. And ultimately, it meant we had no confidence in the software that we were deploying. So what happened? So a group of us got together, so QAs, ADMs, software engineers. We kind of figured out where do we want to get to, what do we want from our tests, what do we want from our deployments, and then we kind of identified what we needed to do. So what did we want? So we wanted confidence in our tests. We wanted confidence in our tests, not just that they'd pass, but confidence in our tests that if they failed, we knew damn why they failed. But they weren't just failing because they're flaky, they weren't failing because they're brittle, they were failing because of a genuine issue in the code. We wanted quicker feedback on our integrated code. So as I said, 4 days before release, that's not quick feedback. So we work on 2-week sprint cycles. That'd be 10 days before you got feedback on your integrated code. We wanted confidence in our deployments in all environments. So test, pre-prod, and production. And ultimately, all this kind of adds up to confidence in our software. So when we talk about confidence in our tests, we decided we'd review our current test estate. As I said, we figured out we had like over 300 UI tests. We analyzed them, we refactored them into service tests. Well, a number of them into service tests, because we had tests, UI tests that were just checking for static content, whereas we could just make a HTTP request, get that content back and kind of check the response. We checked for any visual regressions using AppTools. Anybody use AppTools? Anyone heard of AppTools? Yeah, you do. So basically it can compare screenshot to screenshot. And you can mark areas to ignore. And so it's quite powerful in what it does. You have to be careful, but we kind of now use that to kind of, so once the software is deployed, we have a baseline, we check against the baseline. We know if it's changed or not. If you want to talk about it afterwards, we can talk. We use Source Labs. Hands up, who's used Source Labs? Who's heard of Source Labs? Cool. So it's a Selenium grid in the cloud where we can tell it to run on certain browsers, certain devices, whatever we want really. And that kind of answers the question that we now have control over what browsers the tests are running against. We have health checks as well. So these health checks run before any deployment, well after any deployment. They're the first tests to run and they kind of check that the environment's in a stable state. If they fail, we don't run any more tests because there's no point. And we also have regular running of the tests. So they're now running on a nightly basis to give us that feedback. Again, as I said, it's a quicker feedback. By running the tests on a nightly basis, we kind of achieved that. But we also needed some form of CI process that would deploy the code to an environment. So each teams were responsible for their own release branch of code. We had a CI process that picked up the 4 teams' release branches, deployed it to an environment, and then ran the tests as part of that deployment. One of the key things we wanted to do was make the failures visible, not just for us, but for the CEO who was walking around the business, walking around the building. He can look at our dashboards and say, there's a lot of red on that screen. So this was our dashboard we now had. There's all the different types of tests that we've run. They're all green now, which is good. But this kind of was on the big dashboards above the teams, so anyone walking by could see. And heaven forbid, we'd have failing tests or even ignored tests. So if any tests were ignored, you'd highlight a nice little orange, and any failing tests were highlighted in red. And quite obvious, passed, use it, and failed. So what does this mean? It's all very well having failing tests, but if nobody does anything about it, you kind of end up in the same place where we were before. The dashboard was reviewed as part of the morning stand-up. We made sure that if there were any failures, the people in the teams were empowered to drop what they were doing and fix these failing tests. These are fundamentals. If we can't have confidence in the tests, we can't have confidence in the software. And any code before going into a release branch would need to be tested in the same way that it was before. So the challenges that we faced, there was a real lack of urgency to fix failing tests. And again, as I alluded to, we kind of got around that by having the teams review the dashboard as part of the stand-up and also send out an email of basically what the issue was, how long it's going to take to fix it, and then if they were going to fix it that day or not. We still had the CI deployment took like 3+ hours, which again is not ideal. So it's something that we needed to tackle. And because of the 3 hours, because of that long period of time, there's a lot of Azure and network issues that we faced. So the shorter we could bring that down, the better. The benefits of this were pretty obvious, at least to me. We now had nightly feedback on our integrated code. There was no running the test 4 days before a release and then figuring, oh shit, we can't fix it because we need to release in 4 days. We now had this on a nightly basis, so teams had the time to fix any integration issues. We had visibility of the issues, so before Nobody really knew if the test passed, or if they were run, or if they were muted or ignored. We now had on 3 big screens by the teams the visibility of all the different test runs, all the CI runs that we were doing. And ultimately this gave us confidence in our automated test suite that if it failed, it was a valid reason. It wasn't because Chrome driver failed to start or anything like that. So if we look back at what we wanted confidence in our tests, we wanted quicker feedback on our integrated code, we wanted confidence in our deployments in all environments. So we weren't quite there on this one. So we spoke about CI, but that only runs up to integration environments. So we had test and integration. So our CI environments took care of them, but we still had pre-prod and production. And the main concern was production. But they still took time. They still took like 3+ hours, and that's not acceptable. And they still needed manual interventions. So in regards to the time, the software itself is deployed to 2 regions. But the same region is always active. So we deploy to both regions, but keep EUN active at all times. The reason for this was purely for geo redundancy. So if the EUN failed, we could always flip to EU West. But we identified that's not the most effective use of our resources. So we modified our deployments to kind of take a blue-green deployment approach. So we deploy to the inactive region, switch, and then deploy to the secondary region. And it would stay that way. So this slashed deployment times in half, and we also ran our automated tests as part of this release. We had 2 problems. So the automated tests were running as part of the release, but the issues we found were that data in production changes a lot. I don't know if anyone's been on the ASOS site with the home pages and things like that change quite a bit. So the automated tests weren't ideal for that. And the tests run against the traffic manager, so they'd always run against the active region. So we wouldn't know, we couldn't validate deployment until after that deployment had been switched to active, which could be too late. Customers were seeing this already. So in regards to data, we decided we'd create our own test data as part of the tests. And that's deployed to our production environment as part of the deployment. And the test data itself lives in a specific area, and anyone writing tests as part of this team would use this data to validate the tests themselves. It's not live-like data, because it stays quite static, but it achieves what we need it to do. So the traffic manager said, traffic manager routes traffic to the active region, and we wanted to run our tests in production to verify release. The problem here being that if it always goes to the active region, you are not validating deployment until after you put it to production, and you're testing what customers are seeing. If something's gone wrong, it's a bit too late because customers have already identified it. Who's heard of Akamai? Cool. So for those that don't know, Akamai is a content delivery network. We also use it to route traffic according to a whole set of rules. I think we have like over 800,000 rules in Akamai for ASOS, but that's another issue. So you can use it based on cookies, headers, URL matching to kind of route people to different parts of the site as you wish. So we decided we'd use Akamai to direct the tests to a certain part. We could use Akamai to direct the tests to specific regions. So we could use Akamai to direct the traffic to the inactive region, which meant we could validate our deployment before we push it to live. So this is kind of like a visual representation. So the automated test accesses the URL that matches all the criteria. Akamai then does a check if it matches a certain criteria that we have, and then it directs it to the inactive region. So we could talk about how we use Akamai, the magic that's there, but we'd have to kill you because it's a highly guarded secret. We don't really want people doing that. So again, if we look back at what we wanted confidence in our tests, we kind of had that. We wanted quicker feedback on our integrated code. So it was running nightly, which some people might argue is not enough, but based on the fact that it takes like an hour and a half to deploy, we kind of found it's a happy medium. We wanted confidence in deployments in all environments. And if we look at confidence in our software, we had the 3 above, but we identified that we still didn't have complete confidence in our software. So once the deployments had run and tests had run, we knew the software was in a stable state functionally. We could do some exploratory testing and kind of validate that everything was working. But then we had a release that we put live, and as soon as more than one user was accessing the site, it kind of ground to a halt. So obviously we rolled that back, and it kind of came about that we weren't doing our performance testing the best way. So we did run performance tests, but only as part of, like, similar to the tests before, we ran it too late, and we only ran it on certain releases. We kind of identified again this was too late. What could we do? We decided to shift left. Does anybody else have performance tests running as part of CI on a nightly basis? So it's quite a good thing, right? So we're running these performance tests, and we're not talking like hundreds of thousands of users. We're talking about a set number of users to kind of give us like that baseline. And the results are stored in a centralized database, and we can use that. We have a report that runs and kind of use that to detect if the software is getting slower, if it's getting quicker, and kind of alert us if it's over a certain percentage. Again, so we track over time if performance degrades. And again, as my wife says, size doesn't matter. It's about measuring the throughput, the CPU, over a period of time against a known environment. By doing the same test again and again, you kind of get a feeling for how the software is performing. But when it comes to peak, we do still run peak performance tests. I think we handle upwards of 1,000 requests per second on peak, so we do need to make sure we can do that, but that's kind of on a need-to-know basis. We do that when we need to, as and when we need to. But thanks to the baseline, we do have a good idea of how the software copes. So we did start with the end in mind. We wanted confidence in our tests, quicker feedback on our integrated code, confidence in our deployments in all environments, and confidence in our software. That's still amber, right? So we still need to do more disaster recovery. We need to do more accessibility testing, more exploratory testing, more security, and we still have failing network issues. But we kind of knew where we wanted to get to. But like this old video game, the end is always on the horizon. No matter how far you get, it's always what you're striving for. It's kind of like when Leicester won the Premier League. Once they won the Premier League, what was next? They kind of reached the unattainable, and they kind of struggled the following season. So if you set your goals high enough that you're never going to reach them, you're going to keep striving for them. And that is it.